Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my real pleasure to welcome Dr. Pieter van der Walt here this morning. He is one of 13 authors who collaborated on the writing of a book entitled COVID-19 in Congregations and Communities. I think we are all aware of the huge impact that COVID-19 has had on our lives and particularly on our communities. And he will be discussing some of the conclusions of this book. This book is a product of the theological faculty in Stellenbosch that collaborated on the research that produced this book. Last year, the theological faculty at Stellenbosch organized an interdenominational conference where the conclusions of this book were discussed. So we're really looking forward, Dr. van der Walt, to this discussion about the conclusions that you have reached. Dr. van der Walt was a Dutch Reformed minister for 25 years in Paarl. And in 2016, he was appointed by the church as coordinator of research projects at the Faculty of Theology at Stellenbosch University. He is also involved in Church Mirror that conducts empirical research for the church. He works closely with church leaders as well as academic researchers in his work. He is married to Heidi, an online bookseller, and has 3 children, Hetty, a medical doctor, Elise, a health economist, and Chart, a mathematics student. Dr. van der Walt, we're very pleased to welcome you here, and we're really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the welcome. It's very nice to be here and looking forward to the next hour being with you. I was asked to talk about this book. Now, Gert was the language editor for the book, and the book was published last year in October on COVID-19 in Congregations and Communities. And it so happened that the team who wrote the book, they are at the Practical Theology section at the Faculty of Stellenbosch, and they talked about different aspects of COVID in communities and congregations with their different lenses and from different backgrounds. They are also the most diverse department at the university. So it's very interesting material to read, all these different lenses, an exploration of the influence of the coronavirus pandemic on congregational and community life. And then the editor of this book, Professor Ian Nell, asked me, would I do them a favor and write an epilogue on the book? And I had a short sabbatical in Hermanus during lockdown, and I read through all the chapters and then wrote an epilogue. So then it happened that Gert asked me to come talk about the book. I'm not really going to talk about every chapter and so on, but I'm going to pick up on 1 or 2 or 3 themes that I think that is important and that lives in the lives, in the mind of communities and congregations at the moment. So it's a bit about the impact of COVID and the ongoing questions that we are working with now. And I hope that it will interest you. It will be about congregations, but also about things that are in our lives day to day. So there will be, I think, it touch other things as well. It's not only about congregations. The book has a very interesting chapter about online worship services, the explosion of the online thing, about the spirituality of ministers during the pandemic. There's a fascinating chapter about the experience of the Amakosa people, of their funerals and their grieving processes during the lockdown restrictions. There's one about the experience of people who mourn their loved ones in cyberspace. That is also a new thing, relatively new. There's one about African Pentecostal churches during the pandemic, some lessons learned there about the younger generation, children in congregations, and so forth and so forth. I must also make a first remark. What I share with will, of course, not pretend to be a complete picture or a final picture of research findings. It's not a puzzle already built, but it's rather pieces of a puzzle, maybe. It's rather like a few snapshots that I want to show. But I think although we do not have a comprehensive picture of what is going on now, I do think the snapshots do help us in our ongoing process of making sense of what is happening. And I must also add a second remark. Although I work with different churches in the environment in Stellenbosch, I am grounded in the NG community, and this is the context that I know best. So many of the examples will be from the NG. And I think also the snapshot will be colored by that. You are always influenced by the position from where you look and the teams within which you work. I will start by this. Many congregations are under pressure now. On average, there is a drop in worship service attendance. In a survey that we've done last month together with the university, it was shown that 55% of congregations have lower physical attendance than before the pandemic. More or less a third say it's the same, 10% better. That was quite a surprise. 10% say it's better. But the 55%, of course, creates a lot of tension within this system. There's also a drop in Sunday school attendance. 30% of congregations indicated that their Sunday school attendance is lower than before COVID. Another 16, it is much lower. So put together, Sunday school attendance is lower in almost half of the congregations. And then also the pressure on finances. Almost a quarter of our ministers say, my congregation cannot afford my salary anymore. We didn't ask the financial managers, but themselves, so it's their perspective or their perception. My congregation cannot afford my salary anymore, and another 12% is uncertain. So the pressures are there. Just to say, congregations as we know them, or at least the models of ministry, their way of being church, that's under considerable pressure. A golden thread throughout this book is that COVID worked like a kind of a magnifying glass. At the very beginning, tendencies that were already present in congregations and in our societies were exposed more clearly during the lockdown situation. They were, in a sense, brought to the light. It was there, but now you see it very clearly. You cannot deny it anymore. Just one very obvious example, our awareness of the South African spatial inequality, so-called spatial inequality, was raised, it was lifted. During the days of that first lockdown, maybe you remember when we were so severely restricted 2 years ago now, you were so acutely aware of millions of people that are worse off than us and congested, and that spatial inequality. And some said during that time, a third of our population went hungry to bed. So the pandemic worked like a magnifying glass, but it also worked like an accelerator, I would think, in that changes that were already taking place, that already started to occur in our society and in congregation, in this faith communities, were accelerated. For example, our congregations already started to look at their expensive models of being church. Up till now, for instance, we only had a 6-year full-time and residential university education for our pastors. It's a very expensive model. And pre-COVID, we already started to create new tracks of ministry with part-time training for many second career candidates. And COVID accelerated this. And many ministry leaders within the new track of, in other churches, it's sometimes called a designated pastor or a hulpleraar. I think we talk about dienstleraar. They study 3 years and they get specific jobs to do in the congregations. They are legitimized or authorized to do that, and it's much more sustainable. So at the moment, we have more of these people in our training programs than the normal theology students within the expensive residential university programs, many more of them. And I must say, the type of people that we get to do this, high quality teachers, accountants, people who come into their 30s or 40s and say, I want to do this also. So it is possible for me now to go and study part-time. We do that through the Huguenot College programs and some at the university as well, getting part-time training. And then also at the seminary where they get personal training for personal development and spiritual development. And that is working well at the moment. But COVID definitely accelerated that tremendously. So just by means of these examples, in short, the pandemic worked like a magnifying glass and it accelerated some changes. In the book, I think there are 3 main themes, maybe more, but these 3 really struck me. And I'm going to share with you shortly something about each of them. The first one is about the digital shift that took place in worship and in church life. The second one, the development of a so-called network culture. And the third one, there are some changes visible in spirituality. The first one, for me, is the most tricky one. So I start with the difficult one, so in order not to end with the difficult one. And I'll start with this example of one of the chapters was written by a young guy called Nicolas Mathieu, works in Pretoria, also in the development of online training material for tertiary education and also school education. And he wrote this chapter about what he calls an online memorial culture. So he says what happened in the past when a loved one died and grief was expressed through the different rituals where people came together in person, always in person. Nowadays happens more and more online. So this online memorial culture, it already existed before COVID, but it was enhanced tremendously during the lockdowns. And it's interesting to compare this with a chapter of another of our colleagues, Nobuntu Matuleni, who is a Xhosa-speaking Christian. And she says in her chapter, this is not thinkable for her in a more traditional community. Because when a loved one dies, some crucial rituals have to be performed where that person was born physically. The umbilical cord is buried there. And at that place, some rituals have to be performed, even for them as Christians. So if you cannot go and do that, you cannot grieve properly. It's impossible for her. So on the other side, Nicolas Mathieu says, in our culture, this online memorial culture has a lot of advantages. There's one of the interesting elements of it is that whereas traditional funerals and rituals are bound to that time and that place, the online ritual has a prolonged life. You sometimes see 2 years, 3 years, even a decade that it goes on, that people can participate in the process of grieving and of coming to terms with the death of a loved one and of a friend. So people can go on and on to partake in these rituals with their virtual interactions, even for a long time. Mary Ann Plaatjes van Huffel, one of our colleagues, died in May 2020, during that first lockdown. If you look at her profile page, for instance, there are many, many ritual expressions of the people who knew her, who remember her, celebrate her life. So you see these elements in the online memorial culture of remembrance, of speaking to the person who died, of anger, expressing anger, of sadness, of happiness, of the farewell. So the interesting thing is that this content is generated and read anytime, any place. And this brings the researchers about this say, death and mourning out of the closet and into everyday life. So memorials are not longer just a physical grave that you go and visit on occasion, but digital reminders that pop up unannounced on your mobile device at any time. So he writes this very interesting, beautiful sentence actually. The world comes to feel a bit like a pre-industrial village again, in which mourners are visible to all and tolling bells heard by all. Death are no longer moved away into a closet or a corner. So there are very interesting studies about the digital shift in our worship and rituals. The one of Nicolas Mathieu is one example, but in the broader field of so-called ritual studies, we find interesting stuff where researchers are making sense of what happens in cyberspace when people come together and when they worship together online. Cas Weppener, he sometimes writes in the Afrikaans newspapers. Maybe some of you recognize his name. Also a literary critic, very interesting guy, Professor Stellenbosch of Ritual Studies. He is convinced that we can embrace online worship as part of congregational life. Some people are scared that this will cause our future to be without real festival, without real celebration, but Cas differs. He says that you find it everywhere in ritual studies nowadays that people really value online worship, online ritual. Some people say the digital shift will cause that people of the future will sort of float somewhere in virtual reality and not take real responsibility for their lives. But these people differ from that. So we all wondered, will the people return to the pews after the pandemic? It is very interesting to hear the views of our younger ministers about this. We have a research group of ones younger than 35, a research group of about 10, 12 people countrywide, brighter young ones who study the digital ministry of congregations. They read very interesting stuff. They tell us that the future of congregations is hybrid. So churches who want to reach people in the future will do it in person as well as digitally. And digital ministry, they say, will not be an add-on to the real ministry. It will be the ministry. So they say, do not talk only of digital ministry, but also about the digital existence of congregations and the digital presence of congregations. So they emphasize this kind of hybrid future. People like our African colleagues like Henry Mbaya, he comes from Malawi. Pieter White comes from Ghana, lovely, colorful guy, Pentecostal background in Ghana. They say that during this pandemic, when they think of their churches, they thought a lot about the early church. The early church, called in Greek ecclesia, or the gathering, was not only seen as the tangible gathering like we are used to think of church today, but they were a scattered community, here and there, small groups of people, some places one or two. And they thought of the gathering. The emphasis was less on the physical boundaries and more on being the dwelling place of the Lord in the Spirit. And they say, during COVID, they were reminded of that. So some people would say, no, we cannot be real church now. And they would say, no, this is still real church, maybe closer to what it was in the beginning. It's just an interesting perspective. But just to conclude this first theme, the young research groups say another very significant thing. So they value the digital shift, but they say that in-person church will not go away. But in-person church will be more personal. Say if people go to church and they do not feel that they are recognized, that they are seen, they will not stay. So that also a thing I think that we pick up from this young research group. The second theme is about networks, growth of a network culture. And this theme is basically the following, and you find it throughout the book, that congregations in many places during the pandemic shifted in sometimes even small but significant ways from program-driven institutions to social networks. The ideal picture of church in the past was one of program-driven institutions, and now it's more social networks. It's more about relationship, about connections between people than the institutional thing. There's a chapter about pastoral care and the shift in pastoral care in these times. We also nowadays see this movement from an individual approach to caring for people within networks of relationships. So this rests on insight that human beings are not isolated and individual islands, but that they operate within a network of relationships. I talk a lot to my brother who is a neuroscientist, and he says that neuroscience also talks a lot about this nowadays, that we are not meant to function on our own. We are part of communal humanity. And if we isolate, it doesn't work well. So in pastoral care, in the pastoral care research and training, we see this a lot now, that people move from an individual approach to an approach within a network of relationships. And pastoral caregivers will say something like, I work multi-directed. That's a whole field, but the point is we are not designed to make it on our own. We exist interrelated, we need each other, and congregations can also not do it on their own. Congregations that isolate, that withdraw, are dying. And we see that already happening before COVID, but now in COVID, this is the reality. There are wonderful stories about how the pandemic accelerated the participation of congregations in supportive partnership within their communities. In a place like Citrusdal, there's a beautiful example of various churches that take hands with the boereverenigings. There are 5 farming associations, the forums, other associations, the businesses in town, and they not only give handouts, but they invest in people development. But it's a network approach that works better. There's a beautiful story in Paul. During that harsh first lockdown, young dominees and pastors from the different sides of the Berg River and railway line, they came together and said, what can we do? They couldn't come together physically. Picked up the phone and said, what can we do? And they started an online process of 4 sessions in which they got people in a network together. They said, let us be strong on vision, low on boundaries, weak on boundaries. They started a movement called Hidden Treasures. They say the solutions, the gifts, the sources, the hands that can help are already here. It's between us. It's just hidden. It's buried. So let us help each other to find it and multiply it and apply it. So now through their network, they involve many people in different other networks, because if you've got 12 people with their different networks in this network, you get all those other networks, strong points together. And because they are high on vision, low and weak on boundaries, the energy is wonderful. They've got a mentoring and support program now for young people in the Drakensberg area that developed from that process. At first, they gave people food because people were hungry, but that developed into a more sustainable approach of mentoring support program for young people. The other day, our research team had a focus group session with this wonderful young, diverse team. And they are excited about things like mutually respectful relations. We talk about that. Learning from one another. No top-down. Sharing that comes from the heart. No forcing. Moving from me to us. From I say to we listen. One of the things that they say very clearly is that only leaders who have an attitude of it's not about me can function within a network like this one. Big egos, own agendas, that kills it. And I think there are beautiful networking stories like this one, different places in our country. The point is we cannot do it on our own. So the pandemic really helped a lot of communities to grow their networks. This wouldn't happen if it was not for COVID-19 and that first lockdown restrictions. Just a few maybe interesting slides. We asked church members about their strongest needs. That was during the first lockdown. And the strongest by far was the need to do something for other people. It was even stronger than the need to be with my loved ones. It was close, but it was even stronger than that one. So for every one person that said, I need someone to emotionally support me during this difficult time, 6 people said, I need the opportunity to do something for other people. There's something about attitude. 85% of ministers indicated that they personally found meaning during the lockdown period through service to the community. 98% of congregations were involved in some kind of project in the community. The survey that I talked about last month showed that 80% of congregations countrywide are involved in local networks with other churches, 65% of them in multiracial networks, 60% with other organizations. And the aim of 90% of networks is to work together for the benefit of the broader community. Together with a church group in Cape Town called Common Good, we did research over several weeks during the first lockdown, where we studied the so-called local ecumenical action networks. They are this LEAN, local ecumenical action networks, that the South African Council of Churches, they encourage people to start lean projects in towns. And we contacted quite a lot of them and did a project over several weeks together with Common Good to study the functioning of the lean projects. So we asked them about the key success factors for a community support network, and these were the things that came out on top, and it resonates with all this other data or the feedback that we get and the things in the book. They say, don't do your own thing, gather a herd, connect to existing networks, just connect to an existing network. You will be amazed to see what happens. Attitude of listen and learn, empathy, mutual relationships of trust. It's not top down. It's not I tell you or I show you or I help you, but mutuality. Effective online platforms, transparent communication. So it's this openness. The attitude of the solutions are already within the community, and find the hidden resources once again. I think we can truly say that thriving congregations of the future will be ones that participate in their communities, but then not so much in charity work or in welfare, one-sided welfare work that is organized from above, but in healing the community together within mutually respectful relations. It's fascinating to talk to ministers about this. Our older ministers, they all say, we want this, but we do not know how. We do not have the skills. So they are open to learn how to engage with the other, how to have more cultural sensitivity, even want to learn other languages and so on, but they know that there are restrictions. The younger generation, they are there, boots and all. Many of them, I would say the majority of them, are there, and they develop the skills from young age to engage with people across the traditional divisional lines. And that's what we need in the communities. So we are at a point, I think, where we say, let us give the church to the younger generation. It's sort of a mindset, just to trust the future generation with church and congregation. It's going to look different. It's going to be different. And we have the young leaders who have these attitudes, skills, and live with new habits. I'm going to end with the theme of spirituality, the theme of the first chapter in the book. It's written by the general editor, Professor Ian Nell, who is the contact of Gert. So Gert did language editing, and Ian the academic editing of the book. Ian wrote about spirituality of pastors. He did a research project, interviews with a lot of ministers during the first and second lockdowns. And he says something very interesting. He says metanoia. If you look at the Greek word metanoia for conversion, you sometimes think of a change of mind. But if you look closely at that word and how it functioned in the early times of church, it is rather something like falling in love. So what he says is, the point is that we will not think ourselves out of difficult situations. We will not think ourselves out of stuckness in congregations. To break through the stucknesses, we will have to nurture this desire of the heart to love God and our neighbors. And Ian's interviews with the ministers during the lockdown, his question was, in which ways did the COVID-19 pandemic impact your personal spirituality? And what he found was confirmed by the surveys of last month. Almost 2/3 of ministers reported that nowadays they give more attention to their own spiritual care than was the case before COVID. They practice new habits of faith, like prayerful silencing of the mind, scripture meditation, spiritual journaling, and so forth. And this corresponds with a broader movement that was also tested by a huge European survey in which we also took part. That was not only to church members, but to the whole population, asking about spirituality in a broader sense. And you find it everywhere. I think that's what a pandemic does, or a crisis. It does. It focuses your attention more on enhancing your way of life. You can understand this only in a Christian spiritual way, but it's also broader. In any case, in the Christian church, in this specific denomination of the Christian church, it was tested and proved that people practice new habits of faith and they give more attention to their own spiritual care than was the case before COVID. This is very positive, I think. And as Ian found through the interviews, they generally experienced that God called them back into ministry during the pandemic. They typically said things like, I have learned during this time to look away from myself. I've seen with new eyes how God has walked with me during my life thus far, so forth. A new appreciation and a deepened spirituality. And this makes me think that, many of us have looked our own death in the eye during COVID. We were deeply aware of our vulnerability as humans, and this led to a deepened spirituality in many cases and in many senses. So I would say spirituality in a Christian sense is about the connection between faith or our experience of God and our real lives. If there's a disconnect, you can feel it, you can see it. It will not help anyone, but if there's that connection between my experience of God and my real life, that's where spirituality comes in. To conclude, I think the temptation for many congregations, as for ourselves as individuals, is to disengage, to go into a sort of a survival mode, but it can be different. There will be thriving congregations. They will be led by people who do not withdraw into private spaces, who stay close to people, who do not try to do everything by themselves, who do not merely protect their own territory, who do not fall back into a safe and controlled ministry, and who are willing to work hard and to take risks. I will conclude there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. van der Walt. Are there any questions?
Thank you for the question, Hans. Hans asks whether we worked with the Christian congregations or also Jewish and Muslim communities. I must say here that the organization for which I did the research, Ecclesia, only worked with the Christian congregations. The most data that I have is specifically in the NGK, because that's my job to do research there, empirical research there. But what I presented here was Christian congregations. Gert.
May I add a few comments, please? Editing this book was certainly a most stimulating experience. You have discussed many of the issues that were raised in the book, but I would like to add a few that particularly struck me. Since the physical attendance of church services during lockdown was not possible, the digital environment actually converted homes into sanctuaries, so that churches were not the only sanctuaries in a congregation. And parents had to learn to adapt to this new environment of serving their families, even to the extent of serving communion, Bible study. Another point, you mentioned it was a lady who wrote eloquently about the impact of the restrictions on their funeral rites. And as you have mentioned, when a person dies, in their tradition, the body has to be buried at home. And home is defined as the place where the mother's umbilical cord and afterbirth is buried. Now, during lockdown, it was not possible to transport bodies from, say, Cape Town to the Eastern Cape, where a person might have been born. It also was impossible to conduct the rituals, and particularly the conducting of vigils in the traditional way. This severely disrupted the traditional burial services of the Xhosa community, and one can imagine the stress it created in those families. I was also very interested to read what the pastor who worked in Ghana in the Pentecostal churches said. In the Pentecostal churches, they were expected to perform miracles, and therefore many of the congregational members expect them to perform the miracles and heal them. And of course, that did not happen. That also caused a new evaluation of their services. There are many other very interesting points contained in the book, but I thought I would raise these that struck me.
Thank you, Gert, for sharing. Really fascinating. The home becoming the sanctuary. That's one of the things in the ritual studies, the digital or the in cyberspace, the worship in cyberspace. So some people would say, no, you cut off the bodily existence now because it's in cyberspace. But there are many people who say, no, you are now making it possible to experience bodily the presence of Christ everywhere, not only in church, but everywhere. So that's also a positive from that. It's a terrible thing, the restrictions on funerals. I mean, as Gert now said, you can just feel the the stress that that brings into our community life in South Africa, especially in the traditional black communities. But it doesn't make sense. You are allowed to go to the mall, but the funerals are restricted. Let's just hope that it's over soon. I was at the presentation, what do you call it, the gradeplechtigheid ceremony yesterday at Stellenbosch, where my son got a degree. They split up, for instance, economic sciences into 3 events, less people in, and every student could bring 2 people with him or her, 2 people. And then the experience of the difference between the white people sitting there and the black people. The black people are so expressive. You've experienced that at the gradeplechtigheid. They are so expressive. They are singing and dancing, and it's just something more, it's different. There's talk about cyberspace and about the digital shift and so on. It just doesn't make sense there.
May I say one other thing? I was quite impressed with the academic rigor in the research of the book. I mean, some of the data that was analyzed, they used some very modern analytic techniques to come to the conclusions. I thought, but from an academic point of view, apart from the interest in the people's lives and the spirituality, the rigor was also quite impressive.
Thanks for mentioning that, Gert. It's fascinating to work in that world where people are very strict on, now you're only guessing now. That's guesswork. That's always, you can see that people are just guessing. But to work with the data and to develop theory, not from above, but from the data. It's quite new to me and very interesting. Yes, Gert asked me to just say where you can get the book. It is published by Naledi, so you can order it from Naledi. Hagen Books can order it. COVID-19 in congregations and communities.
Dr. van der Walt, thank you very much for coming all the way to Hermanus to speak to us today and for giving us this fascinating insight into the consequences and effects of this pandemic that we've all experienced and that has affected all our communities. Thank you and good luck with the work that you are doing in your communities and congregations.